Islamic finance is a key aspect of emerging economies such as Malaysia, Indonesia, and Saudi Arabia. And it has grown rapidly. Islamic finance assets increased from $200 billion in 2003 to $3.3 trillion in 2020. So in this video, we'll learn about the basics of Islamic finance. We'll consider some key principles, and then we'll look at some examples of Islamic financial structures. What's Islamic finance? The IMF defines Islamic finance as financial services that follow Islamic law, or in other words, Sharia law. Now, Sharia financial law can be very complicated, so for today, let's focus on a few key principles. The first key principle is the prohibition on riba, which is often translated as interest. That's right, interest, a basic part of conventional finance, is banned in Islamic finance, and the purpose is to prevent the rich from exploiting the poor by making money from money through charging interest on loans. This means that even the most basic debt financing structures, like loans and mortgages which involve charging interest, are not allowed in Islamic finance. The second key principle to remember is the prohibition on gharar and maysir, which loosely mean uncertainty and gambling. The prohibition on gharar and maysir do not allow financial contracts that are too speculative. For example, derivatives such as futures are often banned because they involve one party promising to sell something he doesn't own yet, or something that doesn't exist yet, both of which are too uncertain. Now, a third key principle to keep in mind is the prohibition on financing haram things. Haram simply means forbidden by Sharia law, and the opposite term is halal, which means acceptable. We already know that financial arrangements involving riba, gharar, maysir are prohibited under Sharia law, so they would be haram. But perhaps the most classic example of haram finance is investing or financing pork or alcohol businesses, both of which are prohibited by Islam. In fact, these days, credit cards from Islamic financial institutions are programmed so they can't make payments in nightclubs. Now, we've just gone through three key principles of Islamic finance, but please keep in mind that not every Islamic country interprets them the same way. For example, Gulf region Islamic scholars are generally stricter than those in Malaysia. Now, this creates a special risk in Islamic finance called Sharia risk. That is, the risk that an Islamic financial product, which seemed fine according to one country's scholars, is later declared void for being in breach of Sharia law by other scholars. So at this point we know that basic financial tools like interest aren't allowed in Islamic finance. So the question is, how do banks and financiers make profit? How does Islamic finance work? Let's look at some examples. One classic example is a profit-sharing structure called mudaraba, which is basically a partnership where the financier provides all the capital and the other party manages the business. Both parties agree beforehand on the ratio of profit that the financier will receive, but the financier will bear all the losses. Now, as you can tell, mudaraba structures are usually used in business ventures, but they've also been applied to Islamic commercial banking, where the client provides the funds to the bank, and the bank manages the money and uses it in its business and agrees to pay a ratio of profits received from that business back to the depositor. And in this way, Islamic banks can conduct commercial banking without paying interest to the depositors. Now, other than pure profit-sharing structures, Islamic finance also uses profit and loss sharing structures like musharaka. This is like a joint venture partnership where all parties provide finance for a project or an asset, and they share in its ownership, profits, and losses. Interestingly, musharaka has been adopted for property finance because conventional mortgages which involve charging interest are banned. So how does property finance or asset finance using musharaka work? So let's say a company wants to acquire a property, but it needs financing. So the company could enter into a musharaka contract with the bank, and both parties would contribute capital to buy the property desired by the company. Then, over time, the company gradually buys out the bank's share in the property, and eventually it acquires full rights to the property. And at the same time, the bank leases or rents its share in the property to the company, and the rent received by the bank is its profit for helping the company acquire the property. And in that way, musharaka achieves the same or similar result as a conventional mortgage would in asset finance. Now moving on to our third example, for matters like trade finance, a structure called murabaha is used. So let's say a company wants to buy goods, but it lacks capital. So, their financier under a murabaha structure would buy the goods first. Now at this point, the goods belong to the financier. Then, separately, the company agrees to pay the financier for the goods at a later date, and that payment will include a markup. Under the second contract, the financier immediately provides the goods to the company. Therefore, using this murabaha arrangement, the company has obtained finance for its goods, and the financier will receive repayment and a profit through the deferred payment and the marked up price on the goods. A final interesting Islamic financial structure is the sukuk. Its function is similar to bonds, except of course, no interest can be charged. So, how does it work? So let's imagine that a government needs money. It sets up a special purpose vehicle that issues sukuk certificates, each worth a fixed face value. The money, collected from the investors, is used to purchase land from the government for a 5-year duration. Then this land is leased back to the government, which pays rent to the special purpose vehicle. And the vehicle itself pays a regular payment matching the rent back to the investors. Then, at the end of the 5-year period, the SPV sells the land back to the government for a price equal to the value of all the sukuk, and the money received by the SPV is given back to the investors. Therefore, through a sukuk, the government got the money it needed from investors, and the investors got a profit on the money that they gave to the government through rent paid by the government on the land. And thirdly, the investors eventually got their capital back at the end of the 5-year period after they sold the land back to the government. So in essence, the sukuk acted like a government bond, in that the government got the money it needed, the investors got a yield, got a profit, and the investors ultimately were repaid the money back at the end of the 5-year period. But it's not like a government bond in that there was no interest involved in order to comply with Sharia law. So that brings us to the end of this video, in which you've learned about 3 basic principles and 4 examples of Islamic financial structures. Thank you for watching.